Once we were lovingly molded and modeled by the potter. Then his breath was breathed in us, so that we may live.
Well, good morning, and thank you so much for joining us here at Restore. I know Justin is down in the DR and had questions and comments and concerns all about this morning, but here we are. We made it happen, and hopefully we can put some of his worries at ease this morning. As we've talked about over the last couple of weeks, we are starting a brand new series called The Story of Us. And over the next 4 weeks, we are going to be diving into some different elements that we think are in every part of our story, our collective story. So it's not just your story personally, but it's all of ours collectively together. And we start this morning with the story of creation. Now, I am from a place where creation is pretty flat. I am from central Indiana, and it's pretty flat. There's not much going on there, just cornfields. And then on the off chance, there's a soybean field. We all get excited. And then there's another cornfield, and it's pretty flat. But in the month of May, as the calendar has turned for us, something very, very, very special happens in the state of Indiana. A festival, if you will. A festival that lasts the entire month, that takes over most of the entire state, because like I said, there's not much else going on in the state of Indiana. And in the month of May, we have the Indianapolis 500. It is a almost 4-hour event. It's a race with cars that go over 200 miles an hour on a 2.5-mile track. And it is the greatest spectacle in racing, as they call it. And as a kid growing up in central Indiana, this was the month of May. Like, the local news would move out of their little studio and go down to the track. And they would do news reports from the track. The cars now, like I said, go about 200 miles an hour, and it's absolutely mind-blowing to see them go around the track as fast as they do. This race has been going on since the 1900s. And they weren't as fast back then, but it was still a 500-mile race. Now, I know that because in the center of this track is the Indianapolis Speedway Racing Museum. And instead of going to fun places as a child with field trips for school, we'd go to the racing museum. And it was one of the few field trips where you'd have more dads sign up than moms sign up for the field trip, because all the dads wanted to go to the racing museum. I mean, why wouldn't you? And at the end of your little museum trip, they would get you in a van or a small bus, and you would take a lap in the bus, much slower, around the track. And it was absolutely fascinating and so much fun. And so when the month of May comes around, I love the sound of the Indy cars. I love the thought and just the spectacle of what the Indianapolis 500 is on Memorial Day weekend. That is a part of my origin story. And I think if we went around the room, maybe it's not the Indianapolis 500 for you, but maybe in your memory, in your lifetime, there's a memory that you have, an event that you can point back to, something in your childhood or young adulthood that you go back to and say, this is a part of my origin story. Maybe it's a sporting event, maybe it's family time at the lake, or maybe it's going fishing off a bridge, or maybe it's going to a sporting event or being a part of Little League, or maybe it's something arts related where you get to do music or create something. But if we went around the room, we could easily, hopefully, point to something in our origin story that says, yes, that's a good memory. I like thinking about that. For me, thinking about the Indianapolis 500 is that good memory that just warms my soul. Now, I also know that for many, our origin story isn't maybe as fun as we would like to hope it was. Origin stories full of pain and grief and sorrow and stress, of hurt and broken relationships. Now, that can be part of our origin story as well. And fortunately for us in this creation story, that was not God's purpose. That was not God's plan for us to experience the pain and agony and frustration of broken relationships. And that's next week. So Pastor Justin's going to talk about all of that next week and how all of that came to be. But for this morning, in the story of us, we begin in God's story in the beginning of the Bible. Now, fair warning, pastors, theologians, scholars have been debating and discussing the opening parts of the Bible since it was written. And this morning we will not be able to unpack everything that is discussed in the book of the first chapter of Genesis. But what I hope that we get to accomplish today at the end of our time together is that we will see that God is a good creator, that he has order and purpose, and that there is a purpose for our lives as we see God kind of orchestrating all of it. And so, with that said, we're going to start at the beginning, where the beginning starts, and that is Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, and they read like this. They'll be on the screen as well. But Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 5 read like this. It says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, 'Let there be light.' And there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and morning the first day." Now we're going to stop there. I realize that is not the entire picture of creation, but there's a pattern that starts to develop here that I want us to take a look at. And it starts with this. When God speaks, stuff happens. When God speaks, stuff happens. When God said in the very first part, he said, "Let there be light," whoop, and it happened. Now this is so drastically different than other creation narratives that were happening around the time that this was written. You see, there were a lot of other creation stories that have been creatively put together throughout human history that talks about different deities having a war with each other or having relationships with each other. And out of all of that became Earth and became the rest of the universe. There were all sorts of fights and arguments and quarrels and all sorts of other really interesting and creative ways to describe and figure out how to best articulate what happened at the beginning of the earth and beginning of creation. But Christianity and the followers of Jesus, those people who have been following along since this has been written, have something different. Our faith, our God, when he speaks, stuff happens. There's no war, there's no battle, there's no other relationship. It's God. And solely him. And when he speaks, stuff happens. Put another way, God's words do something. So when we read his word, when we jump into the Bible, when we hear his words, when his words speak, things happen. And that shouldn't be lost on us. To go through the rest of the creation story, which we will in very short detail, watch what happens. First, God speaks, and then light and dark happen. Then he separates the waters from the sky. And he separates the land from the waters. Then he says, we're going to make some land and create vegetation. And then he says, let the sun and moon mark the time and bring light and darkness. He said, let there be fish and birds. And he says, let the land be filled with animals. And then he says, let us create humans. When God speaks, things happen. And that is the pattern that happens through this entire first chapter of Genesis. In the creation story, when God speaks, stuff happens. We get to this last part. And God saves the best for last in his mind. Look at this. This is Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 through the rest of the chapter. It says this. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea, and the birds in the sky, and over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over every living creature that moves on the ground. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has a breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. And then it says this, thus the heavens and earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he'd been doing, and on the seventh day, he rested from all of his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. God speaks. Things happen. And what I want us to notice here is that in creation, in these elements, we get to see a lot about God's character and who he is. If the creation story is telling us anything, it's telling us about the origins not only of us, but also the origins and character of who God is and how he operates and why he is a good creator and why we can trust him with everything in our lives. The first thing to see in this creation is that there is order. Everything in this account is ordered in such a way that it will build off of one another. And every 3 days it kind of refills itself. So take a look at this. Day 1, there is light and dark. 3 days later, there are lights in the sky, sun and moon. Day 2, there's sky and water. Day 5, those elements are filled with fish and birds. Day 3, there are land and plants. Day 6, those elements are filled with animals and mankind. And then on obviously the seventh day, he rested. All along the way, there is structure. It wasn't God just saying, here it goes. Birds enjoy this void of chaos. No. He put all of this together in order. And it had to be this way. Because God is a God of order. And on the seventh day, he rested, which we will discuss in a minute. But what I want us to see is in this creation, there is order. The second part of creation we see is that there is creativity. Now, it doesn't take us long to see how creative this creation truly is. Just take a moment to look outside with all the vast array of plants and animals and fish and birds. And, just think of how many types of cows there are.
Soybean fields.
And soybean fields and corn and lots of corn and tomato plants and all the things that are planted here. There is just so much creativity. I look at what Michigan specifically has to offer after growing up in central Indiana, which was flat and soybean fields and cornfields. Coming here is like, whoa! There's so much to see and look at and do. I think of the sand dunes and the painted rocks, and I think of the lake that looks kind of like an ocean, and just so much to do here and so much to see and so much creativity. And I look back and go, wow, God, you were incredibly creative. That shouldn't be lost on us. Even in some respects, as we move around the state and you see the different rolling hills and the farmlands, there's a creativity and a beauty to it. I think it's easy to get lost in our own daily lives and kind of forget how beautiful God has made this and how creative it is. And it started in the very, very beginning. Another element that was in the beginning was this. There was rest. On the seventh day, God rested. Not because he was tired. Let's just be clear about that. But because God was modeling for us a way to live. He was saying, be creative. Be part of this world. And make sure you set aside a day for rest. Do not labor, do not work, do not toil, do not do all of these things for 7 full days. Man was created and he needed rest. Now, God didn't need rest. He didn't do that because he was exhausted. The seventh day for us is a chance to reflect. It's a chance to take a moment and get some perspective on not only how the week is in, but also where our interests are, where our desires. See, a lot of folks, when we think of a rest day, we try to fill it with something. I want to go do something. I want to have fun. And there's nothing wrong with that, as long as it is life-giving. But we've got to take a moment to reflect. And as God has called us to rest, he's telling us to reflect and say, what is the most important thing in our lives? And hopefully for us, it is to worship and to point and praise and say, yes, God, thank you for all the things that you've created and all the creativity and beauty that you have put together. And isn't it interesting that in the structure of our lives, in this 7-day week, on the seventh day when he rested, he's called us to just put the brakes on. And how in our human nature, we don't do that so well. We have a hard time putting the brakes on because we want to go and go and go and go and go. And everything in us wants to go and go and go and go. And God says, no, put the brakes on. Take that Sunday afternoon nap just for maybe put the race on. You can sleep as the cars go around the circle. Okay? But he's saying to rest, to reflect, to say, take a moment and let's not be all gas and no brakes. Let's slow down and be reflective on who God is and what he has done for us. In creation, there is a larger picture being painted. And the last thing we want to see here in creation is that there is a purpose. All of this was done with purpose. The rest, the structure, the creation of you and me. It was not a haphazard construction project. I've been a part of several haphazard construction projects, some of them my own doing. And every time I start a project, whether it's at home or somewhere else, I kind of get to a part of it and I think, man, I hope this works out. I know maybe you have started a project, whether at home or maybe at school or somewhere, where you get into it and you go, man, I hope this works out. It happened this morning. We were here. And we got here at the time we were supposed to, and the doors to this room right here where we set up were locked. And we made a couple phone calls, and no one picked up immediately. And there was that moment where we said, man, I hope this works out. I hope this actually happens. I hope this works out. I did in our basement, we were working on a few things last year. And I had this moment where we put up some shiplap, where you put the wood boards up in kind of funky different ways. It doesn't have to really be a pattern, but you go and make it look nice. And I had never used like a compression air gun or anything like that. And even with some guidance and some help along the way, there were still moments where I was doing this wall and I hope this works out. I was hoping that it would just come together. And guess what? It did. But I say all that to let you know this. That is not God's approach to creation. Now, that might be our approach to the projects that we jump into, sometimes wisely and sometimes not so wise. But that's not God's approach to this. God doesn't look at his creation and say, well, I hope that works out. Best of luck to you. That's not his approach. And to get even more personal, God doesn't look at your life and say, man, I hope that works out. That is not how he operates. That is not the good creator that we see in Genesis. Remember, there's order, there's creativity, there's rest, there's purpose. That's not just in creation. That's for you and me. That's for us. God looks at our lives as the good God, as the loving God, as the creator with a plan and purpose. And while there will be moments in this life where it might be difficult to see all of this, God is not sitting off to the side and saying, man, I hope that works out. No, he is right there with you. He is right beside you to be the God of comfort and care and rest and purpose. That he is here and he loves us and has put us here for a purpose. And when we start living our lives with a sense of purpose, even if we have a struggle seeing it, we start to see that our lives sometimes line up with what this is doing. And when we do that, you see, we start working as for what we were made for. And the rest of this morning, we're going to talk about what we were made for. You see, the first thing that we were made for was worship. The original posture of our hearts, as you continue reading through Genesis, was that our hearts and minds were made to be in connection and relationship with God. To be thankful for all he has done. To put together all these things and lift our voices and lift our hearts and our minds to give him praise. When God was finished, created everything, he said, this is very good. Now I realize when we look around the world and we see the news that is taking place, the world doesn't seem like a very good place. And in fact, sometimes it's quite the opposite. And next week, Justin will get into that in greater detail. And he'll be talking about why this world isn't very good anymore. But originally, our original purpose was very good. And in this very good state, humanity and God were together in relationship. And mankind worshiped God because he was the good creator, the loving Father, the one that took care of all of their needs and put everything there for them. To say, here are all of the plants that you need. Here are all of the trees producing all of the fruit that you need. Here are all the animals, and here's all the plants that they need. It's interesting that there was no war, no battles. There were no National Geographic things of like animals like killing each other. It's very different. But friends, we were made for worship from this loving God that breathed life into us, and they knew that he sustained them. They praised him for it. They worshiped for him. They were created as beings for worship. Now, as sin and brokenness entered into the world, that relationship was broken and taken apart. But hopefully, in small glimpses, we can see here on earth that we were created to worship. Even people that say that don't have anything to do with church and say, well, I don't go to church and I don't do any of that. We're all created to worship. It's all inside of us. It's just a matter of what we're pointing our worship to. For some people, it's worship of a job or worship of a person or worship of resources and money or worship of substance or worship of leisure. Whatever the case is, all of us again, the story of us, we were created for worship. And our hope and our prayer is that through time here at Restore and through time together, that we will be continually turning our hearts and turning our minds to say, okay, what am I worshiping? What am I pointing my attention to? Is it God? Is it Jesus? Is it Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? Or is it something of my own making? Because I can tell you as a little kid, I love the Indianapolis 500. There were times where I probably worshipped it because I had the posters on the wall. I knew all the drivers. I knew how fast they were all going. There were things and details in my mind that I just had completely memorized. I didn't know any different. I didn't know any better. Our hearts are totally tuned to worship something. And hopefully when we turn our attention, the central object of our hearts and our minds is turned to God. To worship him, to be in relationship with him. That's the second thing we see that we were made for. We were made for relationship. As God said he created Adam and Eve, we were created for a relationship with him and with others. When God says to fill the earth and multiply it, is a strong sense that this world isn't just made for two people. That there is more to this, many, many more. And that by very nature means we are going to be in relationships with each other. We were created for it. And when we're not in healthy relationships, it has a direct impact on how we feel as humans. In recent studies, these are 2021 recent studies, have shown that humanity is more lonely now in human history than it ever has before. In a Harvard study that came out about 18 months ago, of American adults surveyed, 36%, that's over a third, say they have or felt recently a serious loneliness. Now, broken down, in young adults, 61% of young adults have said they have felt a serious loneliness. And 51% of mothers with young children have said they feel a serious loneliness recently. The reasons they give are vast, and they include some of the effects of the pandemic and what's going on, is known as social isolation, where you're social and you've got your phone and you can be social on social media, but you're still isolated from the rest of the world. But what I hope we see is that in the world around us, we were created for relationship, true connection with one another, face to face. We were meant for relationships with our connection, and our hope at Restore Church is that we can bring some of that to a hurting community, to a community that hopefully wants to see hope in Jesus and wants to find some connection and kind of end some of that loneliness. Because that connection is what we're longing for. It's what we're created for. And hopefully at Restore Church we do this in loving and gracious ways, because if there's anything the world needs more of, it's love and grace. The last element that we were created for is one that we won't spend a ton of time on this morning, but is one that we should point out and keep in mind as we live in this world. And that is, we were created for stewardship. Now, as I was talking about what I was going to speak on this morning, one of the kids just asked me what this was all about. I said, oh yeah, we're created for worship, and we're created for relationship, and we're created for stewardship. She looked at me and she goes, what's stewardship? That's a great question. I'm glad you asked. We had a very nice little conversation about what stewardship is. And stewardship is it's a larger word, but it talks about the focus being on taking care of the good gifts that God has given us. In creation, as God is laying out the framework of all of this, he tells humanity, listen, this is good, and this is a gift, and we're here to help take care of it. God gave humanity and everything in it it would need to flourish. He gave us a purpose and He gave us a relationship. And not only to survive, but to thrive in this new world. And part of our responsibility is to help be good stewards of the gifts that God has given us, including creation and everything in it. To take care of it, to look after it. Now, we don't have time today to open up and discuss all that has happened since these words have been spoken, because brokenness and sin and death and destruction have come into the world. But if we as humans are doing a good job of this stewardship, we see that the world can be a bit better place. It can be a bit more hospitable. It can be a bit more loving and gracious and caring. And that makes us feel good inside. And not good for the sake of just being good to be good, but for the sake of we're actually fulfilling a purpose. A loving, gracious purpose to be good stewards of the gift that God has given us. So to be in worship, to be in relationship, and to be good stewards of the gift that God has given us. When we start to live our lives in this capacity, in this way, we start living into what God wants us to do. To love and care for one another, to worship God, and through what God has done in the person and work of Jesus Christ, He invites us into this beautiful relationship with Himself. That is these three central purposes of life, and it's been this way through all of human history. And it's wild because it's almost as if something in human history has been trying to pull us away from these three things, and pulling us away from our good Creator the entire time. And so we must wrestle with that. It's almost as if something was trying to drive a wedge between us and God. So if there's anything to walk away from this morning, it's this. Creation was good. Humanity was very good. And then it all went very wrong. Now that's a story we'll save for next week, but for today as we close, I want us to take a moment to think this weekend, to enjoy the glimpses of how it was supposed to be in creation. The good conversations we get to have, the beauty of God's creation that he has put before us, the times where we have taken care of the good gifts that God has given us. I don't want us to miss these moments. I don't want us to gloss over them. Take a moment and remember the moments that put a smile on your face when it comes to relationships, when it comes to being in a moment that gives you the goosebumps. You say, maybe there's a bigger story going on here. Maybe there's something greater. Those are the moments we cherish. And God has called us to do that, to remember these beautiful and wonderful things. He's put those in our lives for a purpose, to show that he is good, that he is the loving creator, and he is the one that puts us on a path toward purpose and life and love. And so hopefully we get a chance this weekend to remember the loving things that God has done for us in our lives, and that ultimately ends in the person and work of Jesus Christ. As we celebrate it on Easter, as it continues today, that Jesus has come to earth to show us love and mercy. He died on a cross for us because of our brokenness, that we know the world's not right. And we see that there's an empty tomb that offers us an opportunity to trust in him, to be in relationship with him, to live a good life, trusting and loving him. And that starts with a relationship with him. So as we think about all these moments that God has showed us his love, would you join me in prayer as we close today, as we get ready to sing and reflect on what we've heard. God, we see in your created order that you are good, that you have a purpose for us, that you love us, and that in a lot of ways that this world is not reflective of what it could have been. There's brokenness and pain and hurt. But Lord, help us remember the times in our lives where we've seen glimpses of it. Help us remember the times in our lives that we can go and say, yes, God, I see your goodness here. I see the way that you've created and the way that you've loved and the way that you've put things in my life in order, on purpose, creatively. Lord, I know you work through and communicate to every one of us in a little different way, and that's out of your creativity and out of your love. And so I pray that you would help us remember those very specific ways that you have shown us your love and your grace and your mercy. God, I thank you for our time together. I thank you for the ways that you have loved us. I thank you for your son, Jesus, who has died on the cross for us. Lord, you've been so faithful to us. You've not left us alone. You don't abandon us. You don't say, no, hopefully that works out for you. No, you are right here with us in the beauty, in the broken, in the painful, in the highs and lows. So God, help us sing praise. Help us worship you even when our hearts may not feel like it. Help us see your faithfulness even when it's hard to see the next step forward. God, guide us this week and help us be close to you. And it's in your name we pray.